Thank you all very much for coming. My name is Jan McVarish. I'm the Education and Events Director of the Free Speech Union. This event is organised in conjunction with the Academy of Ideas Education Forum, working with Toby Marshall over here, and with Don't Divide Us, working with Alka Sehgal Cuthbert. As you probably know, there's an interesting backstory to this particular event. When I say interesting, I sort of mean appalling. As you probably know, 3 weeks ago, this debate was supposed to happen at a very large educational conference for teachers, parents, and other people with an interest in education. But because 7 of those who were due to attend or to speak complained to the organisers that the presence of one speaker made them feel unsafe.
That was me.
You've spoiled it now. I was going to say to people, guess which one on this panel is the person that made them feel unsafe. And it was little Alka here. So Dr Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, and the reason they objected to Alka was because of her work with the campaign group Don't Divide Us. Well, that's what they said anyway. So Alka was asked to stand down from the panel that we're about to hear from tonight. She was deplatformed. This is how it happens. People complain. They say it's usually a very, very small number relative to the larger group of people who would like to come to an event and hear from a speaker. She was cancelled. That's how it happens. And luckily, Alka is a robust person, but nevertheless, these things hurt because they do actually cast aspersions on a person and make them seem like the sort of person who would make people somehow feel unsafe just to be in the same very, very large conference with them. So these things really, really matter. And anybody that tells you that cancel culture doesn't exist, describe this particular incident to them and see what they think. So her fellow panellists, we should respect absolutely what they did. They refused to take part without Alka, and the session was removed, therefore, from the schedule of the conference. So this is a cynical tactic. The claim of psychological unsafety is a cynical tactic, which at the Free Speech Union we see again and again and again. An awful lot of our cases are dealing with precisely this, whether this on university campuses, in student events, in academic conferences, book launches, as we saw last week in Edinburgh. This happens all the time, and this accusation of unsafety is the one that flies around, and it has great power, but it only has power because people accept it, rather than sort of saying, well, actually, I will guarantee to you that there will be no ideas, and the words that somebody like Alka is going to share with us are not going to threaten your safety in any way. They may challenge you, and they may make you feel uncomfortable because you don't agree with her, but they are not going to make you unsafe or probably even feel unsafe. So anyway, thankfully, the organiser of that conference has since decided that the debate should happen and that it should be participated in by the delegates of the original conference. And so he agreed to share the invitation to this event to the delegates and the online link as well. And I'm hoping some of the people in the room were people who would have liked to have gone to that session at the conference, or maybe they went to the conference planning to go to a different session altogether, but then heard about what happened to Alka and thought, well, actually, I do want to hear what she has to say. And I think online we had over 288 people registered to come to this event. We publicised it. We made it open to everybody to come so that they can find out how unscary Alka actually is. Well, let's hope she lives up to that rather than terrifying us all tonight. So for those watching at home who can't see the audience, we've got a room of about 50 people here. For those in the room who can't see the online audience, we had almost 300 people signed up to join. We've got about over 100 people currently have joined already. For the online audience, I've closed the chat tonight because I'm chairing the event, as you can see, and it's a bit tricky to also manage a chat. But I have got the Q&A box open, and so you can post your questions in there, and please do feel free to do that. We've got one already, and I'll come to the Q&A later on, the online Q&A later on, and we'll put some of those questions to the panel. So, on to the actual topic. This is a weird thing, isn't it? You have to spend 5 minutes discussing why this event wasn't supposed to go ahead. before you can actually get up onto the topic of, that we're supposed to be discussing. So the question that we're going to be considering tonight is, what is indoctrination within education and how might it be avoided? Now, obviously, this is an incredibly live issue. And just as we think things get tricky as it is, world events happen and it gets even more tricky, and teachers are even more on the front line of trying to work out how we explain to young people what's going on in the world. So I'm hoping that tonight we can explore, from the point of view of educationalists, how teachers can be helped to explain the world to young people in a way that prepares them for the world and doesn't just try to send them into it as a mirror image of, or indeed in the sole image of a particular strand of thinking. So I don't want to caricature school teachers as woke. I know lots of people tend to do that, caricaturing school teachers as woke or social justice activists who've lost sight of education. And I'm more than convinced that's not the case. And I know that teachers are on the front line of these debates. And I'm really mindful of teachers such as the teacher at Batley Grammar School, who, what was it, a year and a half ago now, who was effectively chased out of his school for trying to discuss a very difficult topic of the Charlie Hebdo massacre with his pupils and with the questions about the representation of Prophet Muhammad in Islam. And then obviously at the even more sharp end, as if that teacher's experience wasn't bad enough, then we've got what we know of Samuel Paty, which is 3 years since he was brutally murdered near Paris. And now, at the end of last week, we have the murder of Dominique Bernard in Arras in northern France. Obviously, we don't fully know the circumstances of that incident yet, but we do know that he was brutally stabbed multiple times and 2 others were also injured in the grounds of a school. So we take these things really seriously. This is not something that we just think is a kind of culture wars issue in a light sense, or that it's just about being woke or anti-woke. This is serious. So we are intending to fully explore all sides of this debate tonight. So I'll come to my speakers now and introduce them. So on my left is Dr Alka Sehgal Cuthbert. So Alka has worked in education as a teacher, a lecturer and education advisor for over 20 years. She's the co-author of What Should Schools Teach? Disciplines, Subjects and the Pursuit of Truth, and is the director of the campaign group Don't Divide Us. And then on my right over there is John Marrill, who's a teacher of modern history and politics at Strode Sixth Form College in Egham in Surrey, where he's also the gifted and talented coordinator. And then on my left over here is Toby Marshall, and Toby's been really integral in organising this event, so I'm very, very grateful to Toby. Toby is a teacher of film studies and member of the Academy of Ideas Education Forum. He's taught film studies and other subjects in Essex and East London for 20 years, working successfully with both GCSE resit, A-level and degree-level students. And you can look at Toby's Substack, tobymarshall.substack.com, and it's really, really helpful. And he's got multiple articles that he's written about this particular issue. And then we have Ruth Wareham on my right here, who's a lecturer in the philosophy of education at the University of Birmingham and an educational policy researcher at Humanists UK. So I'm going to come to Alka first, and each speaker is going to speak for sort of 6 to 8 minutes, and then we'll work our way through the panel, and then we'll see if they've got questions for each other, and then we'll come out to the floor and to the online Q&A. So, Alka.
Thank you, Jan. I might look like a little old lady, but my children tell me I'm very scary sometimes. So, first of all, I just want to thank fellow speakers here for your act of solidarity in agreeing to pull that session when I was disinvited, and of course to thank the Free Speech Union for, hosting this. What I want to do is lay out my main reasons for why I think that schools in Britain today are at risk of indoctrinating rather than educating, and in the process I hope it will become clear what I mean by indoctrination. I'm less concerned about the kind of explicit political biases that can occur in schools. They're not great, but they're not the main problem, in my opinion. I think as I see it, the main problem is that today, I think we're at a kind of particular social, historical, cultural, political moment where it's never been easier for schools to select the wrong content for the curriculum, to select it for the wrong reasons, and to encourage teaching methods that are wrong teaching methods. So by wrong, what I mean is that they are anti or insufficiently educational. They're more often the result or are rooted in the particular political and moral values of the adults, which are being introduced into the curriculum and into the practice, the general pastoral practice, if you like, of schools, with little or no consideration of whether these social and cultural beliefs and ideas are compatible with the overarching aim of education. So the philosophically sensitive among you will at this point be saying, aha, what do I mean by the overarching aim of education? What I mean by it, and there are competing models, and I'm sure here people might have different views, but for me, I think it would be a sociologically sensitive liberal education that's rooted in a very old classical idea. I think, just to summarise, etymological roots of educare, which is moulding and training, and educare, forgive me, I may be pronouncing that wrong, which is a leading out. I think a more contemporary formulation of a similar idea is found in, so those of you that study philosophy of education, the book of Gert Beester, for example, which is sort of defining a liberal education which is sort of adjusted to the demands of a modern democratic society. And he writes that there are three kind of main functions of education: qualification, which is a kind of sorting exercise, as well as individual achievement; socialisation, the introduction to normative social beliefs; and subjectification, which is the least researched but I think the most important one. Just to quickly say, I won't go into it, but there are problems in all three of those at the moment for different reasons. Qualifications, you've had the intrusion of commodification, faux markets into education that have scuppered things. Socialisation, there's very little political or moral consensus in wider society today that we see daily almost. And subjectification, I think, as I said, is the most important. My shorthand definition of it is that it's to introduce worthwhile content in such ways that the young who have yet to develop their full adult capacities can come to think independently. Okay? It's a developmental process. It doesn't happen in one scheme of work or a term's work or even a year's work. It accrues over several years. And independent thinking is not the same as critical thinking. It does not mean being critical of everything any adult tells you or what the teachers tell you. It's not the Pink Floyd version of Another Brick in the Wall. It involves creating a temporary discursive space where the young are introduced to a world of ideas, qua ideas, as ideas in themselves. That means they have to be, it's a kind of deliberate and cultivated detachment, if you like, from the meanings that words and language has in our everyday social life. It's not absolute and it's not permanent, but it's something you strive for in order to make those ideas independent of their day-to-day meanings. I can explain that more if people want me to, but I won't do it here. So now, the way this has been done traditionally is through the curriculum having a close relationship to disciplinary knowledge, or rather to the school subjects of the curriculum being, having a connection, a structural and intellectual connection to disciplinary knowledge. Each school's subject has its own criteria with which to judge validity, whether it's worth of any knowledge claim, and progress within that subject. So this condition of impartiality and the disposition of being able to take an objective stance, which is not easy. It's not easy as adults, as I'm sure many of us have found out this week, I should think, in conversations. Now, this is often criticised today as a mere ruse for social conservatism or, power ploy or just to keep things as they are. But I think that really mistakes the fundamental thing here, because it's this subjectification, if it's done in this way, that is potentially the most radical gift we can give to the next generation, because it's less about telling them what to think and more about sensitising them to the fact that all knowledge claims, even those of their educator eventually, are open to question, okay? And they have to be open to question. This is what David Lewin calls the difference between, his key difference between education and indoctrination is educators provide a protection from the overt influence of the, indoctrinators and educators aim to influence the young. An indoctrinator will try to influence the young, closing off all options for question. If you're an educator, eventually, you might not be on a Friday morning class with Year 7, but eventually the aim is you're going to be influencing your pupils to be able to think so they can question you, all right, at some point. So I don't think it's conservative at all. Now, it sensitises them to and different types of questions require different criteria for judging them. And some true, false, or more or less compelling. Not all subjects are open to a kind of very clarified true or false criteria, but there can be more compelling reasons and arguments and less compelling ones. When a school, now, in my view, just leaping forward to today, and if you like, the context of why indoctrination is, in some spheres, part of the culture wars thing, it's on the teaching of gender ideology or critical race theory. When a school endorses, for example, decolonising its curriculum, I would say the first question a school and teachers need to ask is this hindering or helping the cultivation of independent thinking? Is the intended gains from this strategy worth the risk of what stands to be lost by introducing this strategy? So some concrete examples. When AQA Exam Board decided to diversify its selected texts under a decolonising paradigm, and they removed Kazuo Ishiguro, they removed the History Boys, Alan Bennett, and they removed The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night and replaced them with 3 authors who may be great authors. I haven't read their books, but basically they were chosen, and this is explicit in their justification, because they're women and because they're not white. To me, that might be a legitimate political criteria, one that adults might discuss, but it's not an educational one. And it isn't just at older levels, at primary levels. When a primary school chooses a book like, if you want to say you want to teach young kids to get along, be nice to each other, you could choose 2 possible books. One is My Skin, Your Skin by Laura Henry Allen. The other one is, for example, The Robot and the Bluebird by David Lucas. David Lucas's book is basically a kind of very beautiful, aesthetically beautifully written book, reworking Oscar Wilde's The Selfish Giant or The Gentle Giant, I've forgotten which one. My Skin, Your Skin starts off with, racism was invented by white people a long time ago because they thought they were better than black people, for primary schools. So you have to ask yourself which one of those books, if you were a teacher, which one of those books would be better for engaging children and leading them out into you're talking about 5-6-year-olds, they're not going to be Kant or Descartes, right? But you're just talking about a discussion that is a bit removed from the immediate social, contextual meanings and pressures. So to conclude, I think there are various reasons why this is happening today. But for me, one of the most important ones is that I think schools have kind of, well, not just schools, I think much wider in society. Not many people really think that independent thinking is a credible raison d'etre, right? They think it's insufficient. They might give rhetorical support for it, but they don't really believe it or affirm it, and they're all too ready. This means they're very ready and open to accept other justifications for what schools should be doing. So I think, and we see this today. For example, I've seen it in my work in Don't Divide Us. I've been quite disturbed to see on many school kind of pages, their promotional pages, the first thing you read is we are an actively anti-racist school. And you have to ask yourself, why are they saying that? What problem do they think they're addressing when they say this? What is the implied problem here? And I think that can take us into quite difficult, controversial political questions, but they need to be had out, right? They can't just be inserted seamlessly the way they are being doing. I think for these reasons, we are actually closer to indoctrinating than educating today.
Thank you very much, Alka. And now on to John.
All right, I'm just going to say that I'm not at all used to speaking into a microphone, nor am I used to actually reading what I'm saying. I'm used to standing at the front of a classroom and kind of... There we go. So nice and loud. Thank you, sir. All right, so I'm going to take an approach where I just kind of try to answer 3 questions, sometimes in a very direct way, sometimes in a much more kind of broad way. So the first question, what is indoctrination? And I think a very straightforward answer to that would be indoctrination in education is denying learners access to a range of viewpoints, a breadth of scholarship, and instead presenting one position as fact beyond questioning. Censorship and propaganda are 2 sides of the same coin. And to me, indoctrination is the outcome of employing both strategies, bombarding learners with only one position and denying them access to others. All right, what is new about indoctrination today? So obviously we have had the embrace of cultural liberalism, and yes, that does seem to be what's new about indoctrination today. So beginning in 2016 and moving full steam ahead from 2020, we have seen educators embrace critical social justice, cultural liberalism, full on, okay? Which does not permit debate and instead relies on an embrace of improved positions in an unquestioning fashion. However, it isn't necessarily teachers or the classroom where these views are being pushed most strongly. And obviously Alka's work has drawn attention to the fact that schools and colleges are bringing in third-party providers and that they are actually bombarding schools with these materials which don't offer them any debate. Okay, so how might we avoid indoctrinating pupils in schools? Well, to begin with, in quite a straightforward way, by encouraging discussion / debate of a range of interpretations / perspectives in the classroom. So I teach in a sixth form college, and for the past 3 years, I have invited Alka in to lead a session. Now, the presentation and the session that Alka leads is going to be unlike anything those students have encountered before. And yet every year that Alka has come in, she has got the most positive response from the students across the board. They don't necessarily agree with every word she said, all of them. Why should they? However, have they all actually been positive about having access to viewpoints that will challenge them? Yes, they have been. And that's the kind of experience surely we want all kids around the country to have. Okay? You know, shouldn't it be the case that it is not for the teacher to police what they are offering students in a classroom where it simply accords with their own position? Shouldn't students around the country have access to as broad a range of perspectives as possible? And shouldn't the concept of academic freedom apply to schools and colleges? I mean, obviously, Alka has spoken to a fair extent there about kind of lower down the school. I teach in sixth form, so obviously the dynamic with older kids is going to be slightly different than it is with younger kids at primary school. Okay? So, you know, let's have a broad debate. Let's have access to a range of positions in the school. However, the position of the government does present a knotty problem, because although they appear to have a role in enforcing balanced debate in schools, they are, if anything, part of the problem. Staff are inhibited within their teaching by structures that Ofsted puts in place and they feel that they have to adhere to. which are, of course, government approved. So, for example, within the remit of fundamental British values, teachers are expected to present they don't necessarily have to do this, but they will feel that they do need to do this, which is to present a kind of glowing account of democracy in Britain and Britain's approach to democracy around the globe. Now, I'm not pretending Britain isn't a democracy. Of course it is a liberal democracy. But is it perfect? Is it not to be questioned? Another fundamental British value is liberty. Now, I know that there are people in here who felt that their liberty was incredibly inhibited during the COVID pandemic. Do we think teachers around the country are actually discussing that? I don't think they are. Okay, shouldn't that be up for debate? Moving on. Indoctrination in schools isn't just about cultural liberals. It is actually embraced by both wings of neoliberalism. Because where do we see discussions in school that challenge the British military-industrial complex? Where do we see a challenge of corporations? I teach history. I watch what's going on in history very, very carefully. I have never seen a post-World War II inquiry that questions the European Union, questions NATO. When I say question, I'm not saying the teacher says you must agree with them or not agree with them. Where are the range of interpretations? I would encourage people in here to go onto the Historical Association website and look at what they offer as go-to materials with regard to the EU and the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you think that they're giving a range of interpretations that are out there, they aren't. I'm coming to an end very quickly. Okay. Moreover, another Ofsted focus is on employability. Do we really think that kids in schools should be told that their principal purpose for being there is to make them a good citizen, well, not a good citizen, a good worker? That you're actually having in your lessons, to embed in your lesson plan, I'm improving employability skills. Well, yes, we'd love critical thinking to be enhanced in every classroom. But is it really about employability? And I'm just coming to the end in a moment. So, how do teachers push back against this? They encourage and embed heterodox debate in their classroom. They present a broad spectrum of positions that don't have to that go way beyond what they personally themselves believe. They invite speakers such as Alka, such as other people in this room now, who will challenge and question the all-pervasive dominant positions within their institutions. They push back against Ofsted structures. And perhaps most importantly, they believe in their students. They don't feel that their students are these helpless little waifs who need to be protected, where the neoliberal construct of safety goes so far beyond safeguarding. We all support safeguarding. Do we support safety, which literally means your views shouldn't be challenged? Let's challenge people. Let's encourage debate. Let's make students feel uncomfortable in the classroom. Let's also have challenging of trainees when they come into your schools and colleges who just are giving out the verbatim parrot fashion lines they've heard at their ITT providers. No, challenge them. And when you see within textbooks and within the materials that Alka has challenged that one position is being presented, push back against it. Let's believe in students, let's believe in critical thinking, and let's actually advance the critical thinking of everyone in this society so that we can have a more effective society. Thank you.
Thank you, John. For somebody who doesn't like speaking into a microphone, you seem to enjoy that. Okay, Toby.
Yeah, thank you. And here, John, you were great. So I want to talk about the teacher's warrant. But before I'll start, I'd like to say a big thanks to the Free Speech Union for hosting this debate. And given that the Free Speech Union and Jan McVarish has been so kind to us all, and I appear to have been promoted from the position of chair to speaker, I thought I might start by making myself unpopular with an entirely ungracious and utterly gratuitous opening provocation. So here goes. I hope to upset you, and I'll be very disappointed if you're not. Do we have any students in the room at all? Not one. Any online? We don't know. There goes my joke. This one is for the students who are not here and might be listening. Forget about the Office for Students, or listen to Ofstu or NUS or your mother. Just listen to me. This one's to the Free Speech Union. Students don't have a right to free speech. It's false. Teachers and lecturers at best tolerate the views of students, and it is the teacher who gives you permission to speak. So everyone, that's my opening kind of gambit on the Free Speech Union. So I've just tried to kind of address that from a different angle, which is looking at the rights and responsibilities of the teacher. And I think this brings us to the matter at hand, which is the teacher's warrant. Students, in my view, don't have a right to free speech, in class at least, because these are specialised social contexts in which particular epistemic rules should apply. Classrooms are places where codes that govern knowledge and knowledge acquisition should supervene. It is the teacher who knows best how these codes operate, and the teacher is therefore responsible for controlling classroom discussions. In other words, the teacher is warranted in restricting discussion within the classroom to that which is pedagogically useful. But do teachers have a warrant to indoctrinate? So this is the other side of the teacher's warrant. By the same token, teachers, in my view, don't have a warrant to indoctrinate. Indoctrination involves teaching that by intention or accident encourages students to hold beliefs, including true beliefs, uncritically. This is bad for understanding. Teachers, I believe, can indoctrinate by a variety of means, both witting and often unwitting, which is why self-awareness is such an important part of our craft. Teachers can also indoctrinate by omitting strong counter-arguments or by presenting weak or caricatured versions of them, and they can also do so by less direct methods, such as the tone of their voice. At best, serious examples of indoctrination, in my view, constitute a weak form of teaching that frustrates students' knowledge acquisition, and at worst, indoctrination can represent a whole-scale exploitation of education for non-educational purposes, and it's a disrespect of persons. Teaching as propaganda, teaching as the recruiting sergeant, teaching as social control. So my opposition to indoctrination stems from the belief that education should be primarily conceived as a critical intellectual enterprise, one in which all ideas are presented in a fashion open to testing, and students are respected as individuals and are encouraged to form their own opinions. In my view, the classroom should be a haven for open but also disciplined thinking, places where students should, to paraphrase the great East End sociologist of education, Basil Bernstein, think the unthinkable without fear of reprimand, and on a really good day, and it is exceptional at the level that I'm teaching, the yet to be thought. So look at this point, looked at from this perspective, indoctrination, which often seeks to stifle critical thought and disrespects the intellectual autonomy of persons. It disrespects their consciousness and their conscience, is a very serious educational problem indeed. Yet in spite of all the good reasons to impose indoctrination, it appears to be growing within English education, with accusation after accusation being levelled at teachers with ever greater regularity and venom. Why? I think we need to step back and ask, why is indoctrination increasing? One reason I believe that indoctrination is growing within education touches on some of the things that John has spoken about. It's that we've lost faith in society and politics. Consequently, policymakers, activists, and many teachers increasingly turn to schools and colleges to protect students from society's malign influence. Sometimes they even use education of children to socialise parents. Reverse socialisation, as the sociologist Frank Frady has described it. This overly despairing and elitist view sees English families, us in particular, and our communities more broadly as incapable of socialising the young, and students as vulnerable and in need of pedagogic protection. It is of course true that students, young students in particular, require the protection of adults. It is our first duty. But in my view, there is too much emphasis on protecting students at the level of ideas within English education, and this sentiment is what drives the call for indoctrination within schools. Paradoxically, I'd suggest that this protectionist impulse might even be contributing to the very vulnerability that it seeks to address, as by overprotecting students, we in fact cultivate their intellectual passivity. We make them more, not less, suggestible. My belief is that teachers need to prepare students to think for themselves, and this requires that they engage them in a range of ideas, including those that are wrong, those that are repugnant, as well as concepts and theories by which these ideas might be assessed. This is one reason why I oppose anti-indoctrination activists who call for curriculum bans on ideological positions and theories that they oppose. You simply don't fight indoctrination with more indoctrination. Truth benefits from the collision with error, Mill said. I'd go further. Understanding truth requires that we are exposed to error, which is why curriculum bans should be opposed. Another reason why I believe there is more indoctrination within English education is that the raft of issues over which there is significant social agreement, I absolutely agree with Alka here, has grown. And this means that when teachers try to address political and especially moral issues, they can't necessarily assume agreement within the wider community. So indoctrination today is driven by two factors. There's a perception of societal collapse leading to calls to protect the young through indoctrination, combined with the absence of moral and political consensus. These two interlocking factors are driving the call for teachers to indoctrinate, which is then met with the simultaneous condemnation of teachers for indoctrinating, which puts teachers in a very difficult position and leads to an invidious cycle of kind of accusation and counter-accusation. It's going to take a lot of wit and intelligence to get out of this situation. And actually, a lot of these issues can't be resolved within education. It takes our perception of society to change to allow teachers the space to educate. So I'd just like to end by talking about a contemporary issue which is coming up, teaching about the conflict between Israel and Palestine and how we might approach that as an issue. It won't go away. We have to think about this. It's complicated. Teachers are going to make mistakes, but we have to have a professional discourse about this because kids very soon, it's interesting, they haven't done yet in where I work, but they will be soon coming to us asking for an explanation of this thing that is happening, this historic and monumental thing that is happening. So I'm just going to look at that briefly before I end. I'm not going to say in precise terms how teachers should teach about this conflict, as teaching about this war in ways that avoid indoctrination, which is what I think we need to do, requires that teachers make contextual judgments, and these can't be legislated for in advance. Amongst other judgments, teachers need to make an assessment of students' existing knowledge and also their sympathies within this conflict. So who's going to take which side in this conflict? However, if we're against indoctrination within education and we're approaching this matter as professional teachers, there are some criterion standards which we know in advance our teaching must meet. They are as follows. Teaching must be legal. Okay? There exists significant legislation in this country which governs what people are allowed to say and not say with regards to this matter. English people, including teachers, do not have an unqualified legal right to free speech and expression on this matter, and teachers, in their own self-interest, need to operate within an awareness of the law, which applies in this room right now to all of us. More specifically, teachers are legally required and professionally bound to avoid language that might incite acts of terror or disorder or discrimination. Setting aside the law, don't get arrested for your job, teachers are responsible for their classrooms and for creating an environment in which all can be educated. Teachers should also remind students of the law of the country in which they live, out of a care for their students, and they should also know that they themselves have a legal duty to inform their students of the law, depending on the sector in which they work. Teachers, I would argue, would also be sensible to think carefully about their own biases and their own politics on this matter, so they can avoid what is, in my view, the single most typical form of indoctrination within England, which is unwitting indoctrination. Finally, teachers must, if they are to avoid indoctrination, offer factually and, where appropriately, conceptually and theoretically informed, balanced presentations which enable students to form their own opinion on this conflict, where, in their judgment, they are capable of doing so whilst also operating within the limits so far stipulated. So that's a contemporary case study. This is something that teachers are going to have to confront. I'm interested that so far, students haven't come to me, but they will be coming to me and they'll be asking for explanations. So I think that provides some kind of ground rules within which teachers might approach this issue. As it currently stands, I look today, the Department for Education hasn't issued guidance on this yet. I imagine they will be very soon.
Great, thank you very much, Toby. And on to Ruth.
Thank you. I too am not used to holding a microphone, so I hope everybody can hear me okay. I was going to start by saying that each of the speakers here tonight comes at this topic from a slightly different angle, but I've actually sensed a note of agreement in all of the contributions so far, and actually I think I'm going to agree with some of what everybody has said so far as well. In what I'm going to say, I am primarily going to be focusing on indoctrination as a disputed concept in the philosophy of education within the analytic tradition in which I work, but I'll also be drawing a little bit on my experience working on education as part of the policy and public affairs team at Humanist UK. So for those who aren't aware, Humanist UK is the national charity for the non-religious, and amongst other things, we campaign for fully inclusive, non-indoctrinatory education about religions and non-religious worldviews like humanism for all children and young people attending schools in the UK. We'd also like to see the legal requirement for a daily act of worship that is broadly and mainly Christian in character replaced with a non-partisan assembly that covers a wide range of issues but doesn't try to advance the beliefs of just one particular faith or belief group. Essentially, then, we campaign for an end to an indoctrinatory approach to religion that's currently evident in schools across the country. Now, as a philosopher of education, I think when we're going to debate an issue, it's really important for us to define our terms. And this is really important with indoctrination because its meaning has shifted quite a lot over time. So the word indoctrinate has been in use since at least the early 17th century, but at that point it just meant to teach, to instruct. And some scholars even think it dates back further to the Middle Ages when it was just synonymous with the implanting of Christian doctrine, which is why it's got the word doctrine in it. Indoctrination actually appears to have retained a kind of neutral meaning for quite a long time. Mary Ann Raywood reports that it took until 1934 for a major dictionary to first attach a derogatory meaning to the term. But at this point, it's almost universally used as a pejorative. So, as Ernest Horn puts it, to brand any act of teaching as indoctrination or propaganda is to damn it in the eyes of the educational world. And what's more, and we've heard a little bit about this already, people seem to spot indoctrination everywhere. So not only in schools where teachers are variously accused of the practice for teaching or providing information on religion, LGBTQ+ equality, anti-racism, British values, sex education, singing nationalistic songs. These are all real examples that I've found in the press and more, but we can also supposedly see it in BBC children's TV programmes, Disney cartoons, storybooks, plays, online communities. Essentially, wherever there's any kind of influence, there are reports of indoctrination. Unfortunately, I think that while some of the teaching practices that people label indoctrination may be genuine cases of the phenomenon, many are not. And the term is increasingly bandied around simply to describe the teaching of content the speaker doesn't like or possibly doesn't agree with, doesn't think it ought to be taught. From my perspective, the first thing to understand about indoctrination, at least if you're talking in the educational world, is that it is a form of teaching. It is about intentionally getting or trying to get someone to learn something. The second thing to understand about indoctrination is that it is about teaching for beliefs, as distinct from behaviours, habits, attitudes, or dispositions. So I indoctrinate people to believe certain things, but if I want them to do or feel certain things, that would be better described as conditioning. The difficulty is these things come apart conceptually, but they may not come apart in practice. So sometimes people are pointing at something saying that it's indoctrination when in actual fact it's a form of conditioning. Most analytical philosophers of education agree that these two criteria are necessary for indoctrination to be taking place, but there are disputes about the other features that have to be present for a form of teaching for belief to count as indoctrination. So, of course, not all belief transmission is wrong. In fact, education really relies on us being able to get children to believe things in order to understand and be able to function in the world. So we want to be able to transmit beliefs to children. The 4 additional criteria of indoctrination that philosophers argue about, and we've heard some of them already today, are method, content, intention, and outcome. So those who endorse a method criterion think that indoctrination involves certain ways of teaching. So they might point to things like drilling or rote learning, learning without understanding. However, that view can be problematic because it seems that those kinds of methods are going to be appropriate in certain contexts. Are you going to be able to teach children quick recall of times tables without some kind of rote learning? Are you going to be able to teach them French verbs without doing some kind of drilling? With this in mind, some have suggested that it's the content of teaching that really matters. So indoctrination can only happen if you're teaching what we might call doctrines in religion or politics, for example. But the problem with that idea is that even doctrines, which you can think of maybe as webs of related beliefs, may include well-evidenced facts that it seems that it might be appropriate for teachers to teach directively alongside more disputed ones. So if you consider some of the established historical facts about the life of Jesus, for example, it would seem perfectly okay to maybe teach those directively, even if you wouldn't want to teach the wider doctrine of Christianity directively. And what's more, it seems possible to get people to believe things which aren't doctrine in a dogmatic or non-rational way. Perhaps no one would bother to do this, but it does seem possible to do it. So some theorists then move away from content and method and try to define indoctrination in terms of the intentions of the teacher. But this rules out, and we've already heard a little bit about this already, unintentional indoctrination, which it seems to me happens a lot. Many people pass on unevidenced or unverifiable beliefs in less than rational ways because they themselves were indoctrinated. They're the beliefs that they have. They don't intend that their pupils somehow develop these unshakable beliefs irrespective of evidence. They've just misread the evidence themselves or the reasons for it, and that might not be their fault. They might not be to blame for this. If somebody's been brought up in a very high control religious group or in a cult and then they pass on those beliefs to their children, or they teach those beliefs to children in their community, we might not want to blame them for it. So with all that in mind, in my view, the best candidate for that final criterion of indoctrination relates to its outcome, its consequence. So although because of their disputed truth status, indoctrination is more likely when one's teaching controversial subjects like religion and politics, as we've heard, it's not necessarily confined to these subjects. What matters is whether the beliefs that form as a result of the teaching are based on and responsive to evidence and reason, whether we can subject them to criticism and change them if the evidence or reasons change. Indoctrination is teaching which, by neglecting rationality, sets up a kind of illegitimate barrier between the beliefs an individual has and her reasons or evidence for having them. It puts them beyond question, and it makes them really difficult to revise them should the evidence change. Maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult. We've got to be aware that we're all capable of indoctrinating and of being indoctrinated, including, I think, with true beliefs, if we hold those true beliefs in a non-rational way, if we hold them for a way other than to do with their evidence or reason. This means we've got to be prepared to subject our views to criticism and revise them if and when evidence arises to suggest they're untrue. It also means we need to be really careful about how we teach topics where reasonable people disagree. Topics like religion and politics, I think, should certainly form part of the curriculum. We shouldn't be avoiding those. I'm with Toby on the idea that there shouldn't be any kind of curriculum ban on certain subjects. However, they should not be taught in a partisan manner, i.e. one which prejudices learners towards a particular answer. Now, that can be incredibly difficult, not least because some topics about which people actually disagree are not, in fact, open to dispute in an epistemic sense. So perhaps, for example, the view that man-made climate change is real. There's behavioural evidence that people disagree about that subject, but it's not the case that epistemic authorities disagree about that. However, all educators, in fact, everyone who's responsible for any kind of upbringing of children, so this includes parents as well, have a responsibility to be aware of this problem and attempt to avoid indoctrination as much as possible. We've got to acknowledge that it goes on, that any of us could do it, and that we need to be very careful to avoid it. Thank you.
Okay, my goodness, I feel like I've written an essay here in my notes, which you can mark later. I mean, are there any obvious questions that you want to ask each other? I mean, there are some really useful distinctions here, I think, which are not the obvious ones that would have occurred to me. But so this distinction, though, which probably is the obvious one, between critical thinking and independent thinking, do you agree on that distinction? What do you think about it, Ruth? I mean, is it one that you mull on a lot? I mean, what?
I'm not sure if I fully grasp. I don't know much of Biesta's work, so I don't know quite how this conception of independent thinking is distinct from critical thinking. When I'm thinking of critical thinking, I am thinking of, subjecting the ideas that you hold to rational debate, to looking out there to see if the evidence upholds them, to asking if you might be wrong about things. But I don't think I know enough about Biesta's work to know how that conception differs really from what he says about it. In fact, one of the things that I wrote down was that I wanted to hear a little bit more about this idea of independent thinking.
And I think the reason why that occurred to me as the question that I wanted to ask was because as an outsider to education, apart from having been a parent, it seems that a lot of the things that are being taught in the name of critical thinking are the very things that other people see as indoctrination. So how do we make sense of what's actually going on?
Well, I think it's, for me, the way I understand the difference, and I mean, they seem like they're very similar, but I think the difference is kind of perhaps one of tenor. Independent thinking, I think actually you described it, I'd agree with a lot of your description. It's when you hold a true belief volitionally, with intention, having, it's not something that has been accepted without you having gone through your own internal process of thinking it through. What are the inferences? If I accept this belief as true, what must the world look like? Does it fit with my experience of the world, my daily experience of the world? Can it explain my experiences? Can I make predictions from it? Those kinds of questions, I think. Now, critical thinking can be similar, but I think it's a more sociological tenor, and because of that, it's become quite, it's become kind of overgeneralised, it's lost its specificity, and it's become over-politicised as well. It's like seen as to change the world, you need to make critical thinkers out of students, which I would disagree with, because I think to change the world you need politics and critical thinking. I mean, there's another more academic meaning around it, which is to do with critical theory, wider critical theory that goes back, has a sort of academic history that is not, but I don't think that's the most relevant thing here. But I would just say that for me, independent thinking just distances it from the overtly politicised usage of critical thinking today.
Okay, thanks, Alka. Toby.
Thanks, Jan. Yeah, I don't know Biesta's work, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I think there's, if you like, two uses of the word criticism within educational theory, and they're quite distinct. So type 1 is within liberal traditionalist educational thought, and that sees criticism as tied to disciplinary thinking. So it's something that the discipline does, and then criticism is something that's located within an academic tradition. And then there's type 2, which is the more modern version of criticism, which I don't agree with, which is criticism as something almost transdisciplinary, outside of a discipline, or a generic set of orientations towards content, independent of any kind of disciplinary mooring. So classic kind of liberal philosophers of education have used criticism as something that emerges from an engagement in different forms of public thinking and disciplinary thought, and as being the goal to which all education strives, criticism, but using mathematics, using whatever the disciplinary form that would be appropriate to the thing that it is you're criticising. And that's different from criticism how it's commonly used in contemporary educational discourse. It's used as a kind of free-floating, separate from a body of knowledge, concepts, theories, methods and criteria by which you might assess something. So that type 2 I think is a bit vacuous. Type 1 is profound.
Thanks, Toby. And then John, I just wanted to, as you are teaching just pupils at sixth form level, and you raised this question about academic freedom becoming appropriate at that kind of age, and then also because you are teaching the gifted and talented section, presumably you need to challenge those students. So just could you just tell us a bit more about what that looks like? You know, how far do you go in allowing a free-for-all amongst between the pupils, but also between you and the pupils in terms of that kind of challenge?
Well, I don't really think that there need to be parameters on what is acceptable within the classroom, you know, other than, oh, you're inciting hatred. But who is actually going to be doing that? And what scholarship actually does that? So it's perfectly appropriate within the classroom to present a broad range of interpretations that are out there and enable students to engage with them. I mean, my kind of conceptualization of critical thinking is in line with what Ruth has said, and also hearing what Toby said there as well, you know, I would be in sort of in line with that. So within the classroom, there doesn't need to be parameters on what's discussed. Within the gifted and talented group that I teach, you know, that is just even more entrenched. I mean, I can give an example. Peter Ramsey. I used his book recently with the gifted and talented class. They haven't had access to that before. And those who, you know, they was quite stunned by it. So why not provide access? Just another point, though, linked up with what's just been said. With regard to critical social justice within the education system, and Alka may disagree with me on this, I don't see that that's actually really about transforming society. To me, it is actually a prop for neoliberalism and actually not bringing about economic change within society. And identity politics is class politics. And actually, what we present as leftists within education are actually cultural liberals who are not bringing about structural change.
Thanks, John. Right, I'm going to throw it out to the floor now because I'm aware that time is ticking away really quickly. Rob, can I ask you a favour? Could you pass the mic to people? But also feel free to ask a question if you want to. Thank you. Just here. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you. I must admit that listening to the speakers, it's quite difficult to sort of get a handle on this, because you seem to be really doing the opposite of what I thought you should be doing, which is opening up debate, and finding ways to close it down, and finding ways to justify not challenging kids with difficult ideas. And I think if there's one thing that's true today in schools, is there's almost a uniform approach to how we deal with a multitude of issues. The environmental issue was brought up as if that's a given, that it is decided, that there is no criticism. I'm sorry, that's not true. There's a hell of a lot of people who don't feel happy with that, and they can put forward quite robust arguments against it from different perspectives. Put it another way, when we teach, and I'm a science teacher by trade, when we teach science, we lie. We lie deliberately. So when I teach youngsters about Newton's laws of motion, right, I know they're wrong, but we still teach them. We do it because there's a purpose to what we're doing. And so in that way, sometimes when we put forward an idea, a challenging idea, which may be something about, you mentioned Palestine-Israel conflict, I think I would loathe to put forward the equality of the two sides in that conflict to children and let them work it out. Don't we have the guts to decide a view, a moral view that might be right?
Okay, thank you. Right, over the other side, the lady in the white top.
Thank you, and thank you to all the speakers. It's very interesting. I just have a question for Toby, actually. I was really fascinated when you were talking about the some impulse within the teaching community to protect children from social and political, protect children from, social and political collapse in a sort of context of political cynicism, or at least that's my sort of summary of what you were saying. And I would really like to know a little bit more about that, and whether there's a political position there. Could that be defined in terms of a political party or a political ideology? I know there's lots of people who say, oh, actually within the teaching profession now there's a lot of communist ideas or communitarian ideas that are within the teaching materials and there's a teacher training schools. And so we now have sort of that, and actually that might explain the sort of indoctrination aspect of it, because obviously within societies which were governed by that particular political position, education wasn't sort of open and free in the way that we would like it to be in this country, or believe it is, or used to be, or whatever. But I'd be really interested to know whether there was actually some sort of way of defining it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just take one more. The chap in front of you there, and then we'll come back to the panel. I'm aware that we haven't got that much time, so that's why I'm taking clusters of questions.
Thank you. I think mainly for Alka, but for anyone else who wants to answer, do you think there's a deeply racist heart to anti-racism as it's presented? And I ask this because the idea seems to be presented that black kids are only interested in black authors and black history. This suggests they are not, that they are just helpless victims and can only learn if they're spoon-fed as victims. And they're not. And critical race theory, which has definitely crept into people's thinking, suggests that they are blameless victims incapable of agency, and they're not this either. It seems to hide behind the word anti-racist, whereas I think people who really do carry the critical race theory forward only want to produce critical race theorists in every lesson. Anyway, that's what I think about.
Okay, thank you. Right, shall I come back to Toby first, just so you can answer that particular question?
Okay, yeah. So is there one political position that is driving people to indoctrinate within schools within England? No, I don't think it is. I think it's actually both a left-right thing, and perhaps actually it's the collapse of left and right. It's the kind of end of ideology, which means which leads to the politicisation of education. It's because people from the left and the right no longer believe that they can achieve meaningful societal change, that they're looking to education as the forum through which they're going to advance their political agenda. I mean, and there's been elements of that in the past. I mean, you can talk about a kind of radical conservative position or a radical left position and indoctrination in the past. You can talk about Catholic education. I mean, there are examples. Bertrand Russell wrote a lot about indoctrination in the eye of the Second World War. And there were radical left, radical right orientations towards education which sought to indoctrination. But I don't think there are the grand ideological projects anymore. I think it's the exhaustion of those grand ideological projects which is giving rise to this fear of ideas and that impulse to protect, overprotect students at the level of ideas within education. So everyone's guilty at that. And if you had a robust belief in your own ideological position, you would go out there and argue it with other adults. You wouldn't use education for that purpose.
Thanks, Toby. I know, Alka, you wanted to get in earlier, so.
Oh yeah, but I'll leave that. I'll answer the questions that have come up. Is today's CRT-based anti-racist content in schools racist itself? Yes, I think it is. I think what it does is it prioritises race or ethnicity as the primary ontological category in which we're encouraging children to see themselves and with which to see other people. And that all social arrangements from that should be adjusted and conceived and implemented to addressing addressing statistical disparities just on that criteria alone. So I mean, I think John said that it is class politics. It is and it isn't. It's kind of it's displacing class as the main category. And I think, you know, not just from my political view, but I think methodologically, in a sociological sense, class is a closer proxy to disadvantage. So if you want to try and use policy to ameliorate disadvantage, that would be your go-to category rather than ethnicity. I think also it's explicit. This isn't my interpretation. If you look at the material which we have done in our second report, it's available online. In their own words, you will see many of these equality, diversity and equity diversity, equity and inclusion companies explicitly say the colourblind approaches to racism and anti-racism are themselves racist. Now that is not opening up, that is closing, right? So it's very close to indoctrination. On Dave's question on shouldn't we take a moral stand on Palestine or Israel, absolutely. But I distinguish between myself as a citizen, an adult citizen, and argue and have been arguing on the need to do that with adults. When I walk into a classroom, first of all, I would say schools should not feel obliged to teach it, right? There are lots of things happening in the world out there. Atrocious, good, bad, boring, ugly, beautiful. You don't have to teach everything. Just because it's on the news every night, you are quite within your right as a teacher. You have a teacher's warrant to say, this is a really important thing, but we are not going to discuss it in school right now or in this class right now. You can give your reasons why if you want to. It's too controversial. It would take too long. This is something you might want to ask your parents about. You're quite legitimate to do that. If you decide you do want to do it, then I think you have to hold your own individual moral view. You have to hold it in abeyance. You have to act as an educator, and that has its own moral values, and there can be different ones. For a social justice advocate, it would be safety or something like that. But for a liberal educator, it would be freeing of the mind through the subject. Through the subject. That is crucial. I'm not for bans, but I am for selection, right? And the selection has to be reasoned and justified according to the principles. And I will happily argue with anybody why David Lucas's book for a 5-year-old will be better than Ibrahim Kendi's, and my reasons won't be political, they'll be aesthetic.
But I just wondered, one of the things that seems to underpin our concerns about this question of indoctrination and education is a really profound fear and anxiety about the next generation, and a kind of really profound sense that we sort of need to both we need to hold children more tightly in order to ensure that they don't just kind of spin out of control. So what you seem to be arguing, and John was saying similarly, is having more of a sense of a kind of trust in children and young people. But how do we do that while also combining it with a need for society to actually be confident about the transmission of its own values?
Well, just to answer the questions more, and sort of that will relate to what you've just said. I mean, to the lady over there talking about have communist ideas kind of permeated teaching resources, absolutely not. You know, we hear all this talk of cultural Marxism, etc. Critical social justice may have some kind of vague links to Marxism, but linked up with what Alka said. When I said, identity politics is class politics, what I mean is it is the elite who are focusing on identitarian concerns to actually distract and avert attention from class. So the idea that you've got some centering of class within those materials, no, in terms of structural change. Now, linked up with what's just been asked here, what I would say is that a lot of this kind of sort of hysteria that we've had over the past few years is actually because social liberalism has broadly achieved what it set out to do. We do not live in a society that is hugely racist, hugely homophobic, hugely sexist. All of the great work that social liberals did post-World War II to actually challenge those heinous elements that were in society have broadly been achieved. Of course, there are racist attitudes, etc., around, but legally that is not being entrenched, that is being combated. However, what we have is an ever more unequal society in terms of wealth. And so you could well argue that a focus on cultural liberalism is to divert attention away from that. And what Toby was saying about consciousness, I think, I'm never quite sure who is conscious of what they're doing and who isn't, basically. Okay? So, but in terms of our consciousness within the classroom, let's not feel the need to protect all kids, and let's not actually feel that they can't actually question what's going on. But to come back to the question about anti-racists and racism, I think it is bad faith to accuse them of being racist. Unintentionally what you're doing might have that connotation. But actually, to me, there is this debate that has this person's racist for this reason, and over here they're racist for that reason. When the reality is there are very few people in society who are actively discriminating against anybody. And so, do I think that that's what these anti-racists are doing intentionally? Absolutely not. They are ideologically captured by a particular brand of thinking, which can lead to how you've interpreted it over there. I don't deny that. I can understand why people are saying that, but I don't want to kind of have a negative view of people who think they're trying to help people, even if maybe they're doing it in the wrong way.
Yes, I wanted to pick up on your question about closing down debate. So I thought that perhaps that had something to do with my point about there are subjects about which epistemic authorities don't disagree, even though in wider society we might see disagreement. There's a really live debate in the philosophy of education about what subjects we ought to teach as controversial. Now, we've sort of heard a bit of a discussion of kind of standing back and allowing kind of every belief to be criticised. And that's okay within certain limits, because of course we do want children to believe things that are on the whole true, right? We want their beliefs to track the truth. So we don't really want to open up every single thing that we are teaching in the context of a classroom to debate. It's sort of in line with what you were saying, Alka, but I'm not thinking here about kind of political debates necessarily. So just because people disagree about something doesn't mean it's necessarily controversial in an epistemic sense. But the tricky thing here is that people might be disagreeing about something in the public sphere, and then there might be educational reasons to talk about that kind of a debate. And so the teacher is always having to make these choices. Is this something about which authorities disagree? Can I direct children to believe this particular truth? Or do we have to kind of stand back and do the both sides thing? And I don't think that these are easy decisions, because there might be circumstances in which perhaps everybody has sort of decided that something is the case, but actually it's more controversial than they think that it is. And the teacher might want to discuss that. So it's not about closing down debate per se, but it is about recognising that the time you have and the resource you have in the classroom is limited, and you're not going to want to debate absolutely everything, and you want to debate the things that are going to be educational and purposeful for the children, but you don't want to indoctrinate them. And I don't have necessarily an easy answer to how you do this, because this is the preoccupation of my academic life. What things can we direct children to believe, and what things is it very important that the teacher stands back and is a bit more neutral about? And I don't think it's an easy question to answer.
Thanks, everybody. Right, a few more questions from the floor. I can't. Okay, yes, here, Shirley.
Thank you. It seems to me that what you've been, all of you, in fact, have been explicating and describing is a mammoth job for teachers, in the sense of what a teacher needs to know and what skills they need to have in order to be able to, skills and knowledge more than anything, in order to be able to help develop young people in their independence of thought. And I do think that we can't dismiss certain aspects of education, and I think in particular environmentalism, because I think the way that our environmentalism is taught isn't in an educational way at all. And I do think it's a prime example for us to think about, well, what is it that teachers need to know and to be able to express in a way that helps children to understand and have an open mind about things, rather than, you know, the sort of closing down that we've been talking about. So what teachers, do we have those teachers? And if not, where do we get them from?
Thank you. And then if you just put your hands up again, okay. I'm just going to take a couple from the chat, from the Q&A, if people could just take a note of these. So the ones that have been upvoted by the most people. The first one is from Duncan, who asks whether the panel agrees that a basic level of understanding of logic needs to be taught at a much younger age in schools. And he's talking about concepts such as syllogism, devil's advocate, etc. And that the kind of more analytical skills that could be taught at a younger age and taught better. And then Mix asks, can a biology, throwing this in at the last minute, can a biology teacher teach genetics in the face of gender ideology? Just a little one there for you at the end. Okay, with the grey jumper here, Rob, thanks.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion so far. What if you believe, as a parent or a teacher, that there are some pernicious ideas that are completely dominant in education that will need probing or questioning? One of them's already been mentioned. Well, both of them been mentioned, actually. White privilege, which I think goes under very many different guises, and the moral equivalence of violence. I was standing outside the principal's office with my sixth formers waiting to go in for a meet and greet. He was on a conference call, so we had a bit of time. It was 4 days after the invasion by Hamas into Israel. And as a sixth form leader and teacher, I just wanted to probe and ask. No one had been discussing it. And I was worried about that, in reference to Toby's comment. No one had been discussing it. So I asked, and I asked a really responsible student, what do you think about what's been going on? And not in a casual way, but in summary, well, they had it coming. And I thought, right, okay, this is why it hasn't been discussed. It's because they assumed that Israel was going to get this kind of attack, which made me ask other questions. So I'm concerned about, I agree with what Toby's saying about the duty of, and the pedagogical duty of teachers to look at all sides, but I'm also very concerned about certain ideas that are completely dominant in education, and because they're dominant, they don't get questioned.
Thanks, thank you. Any other, okay, just down here, and then we'll come back to the panel for the final remarks. Thank you.
This was really after clarification from Alka, I presume, about the fact that this event should have happened at a conference a few weeks ago, and the reason that it didn't, and my understanding of it, I don't think is complete. Perhaps you might be able to help me with that. I got the impression that going onto the website, as I did when I saw the story about your cancellation, that what had happened, a number of people had objected and said that they felt unsafe. I don't know, how many people was that? 7. And that none of them were actually involved in this particular part of the conference, but they were taking part in it. Would it have been possible for the organiser of that conference just simply, rather than cancelling you, to have turned around and said, well, if you can't stand the idea of other ideas besides your own, perhaps you shouldn't come. Was that ever considered as an option? And if not, why not?
Thank you. That's a very good, lovely circular question on which to end to bring us back to the beginning. Okay, what order did you speak? Shall we go back along the panel for final remarks? So we start with this is the wrong way around now, isn't it? I'll let you come back finally on that question in your final remarks, but let's start with Ruth.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up both the point about it being a mammoth task for teachers. I absolutely agree. And do we have teachers who are trained and knowledgeable enough to deal with all of these issues? Probably not, because there are so many of them, and teachers are constantly having to make decisions about what they say in the heat of the moment. And I think my heart goes out to them, really, because it is very hard to make these decisions about what you say about these very hot button topics. So that requires knowledge, but it also requires knowledge of what you don't know, and the ability to admit to children and young people that you don't know it. That's okay. When I was a primary school teacher, I would often, if children asked me a question and I didn't know the answer to it, I would say, I don't know the answer to that, let's find out together, or what do you think about it? And throwing that open to those children and young people to actually have a think about that. And I think there's a push for teachers to be the expert in the room all of the time, but it's actually okay to say sometimes that you don't know, or that this is controversial and different people think different things, and that perhaps you need to work through that together. And that brings me on to the question about logic and rationality, because yes, I agree we ought to be teaching that in schools. I think one excellent way to do that is through philosophy with children. We shouldn't start with syllogisms. We can start with talking about a problem, talking about a dilemma, trying to generate responses, thinking through whether those responses actually hold together as an argument. And gradually we can get to the point where we can be looking at both informal and formal logic. But I think we can start very young with children. At nursery level, you can do these sorts of open discussions, and I think it's important that we do that. But that brings us back round to we need teachers who are trained in order to do that. So yes, it is a mammoth task, but I don't think we should turn away from it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to then come to Toby.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come back to this point that was made at the front, which I think is really a kind of pivotal one. And I'm going to kind of try and flip this one over a little bit and say maybe the problem, maybe a problem, isn't indoctrination, but that there's no doctrine in indoctrination anymore. One of the problems within education could be, in fact, that young people have nothing to respond to in terms of adults taking a moral position or a political position on things. So my father was educated by the Jesuit brothers in St. Francis Xavier School in Liverpool, and lots of indoctrination and the Immaculate Conception and transubstantiation and all that. And he also got a fantastic education, steeped in the classics and history, as the Jesuit brothers would give you. And that's the tradition of Catholic education. It's kind of got this kind of parallel academic and traditional, and also actually quite liberal in its conception form of education, encased within a kind of religious framework. So I'm just suggesting I'm not sure we've really nailed what the precise problem is with the moment, with this particular moment. And what David was suggesting, which I do think we need to consider, is that you can have an absence of indoctrination. Sometimes you can have indoctrination without any doctrine, without any content, and without an adult moral and political perspective for kids to respond to. And I'll give you an example. Last time I talked about Israel and Palestine and had a discussion with students about it, I, for the purposes of the discussion, adopted what I took to be the mainstream Israeli security position, because I imagined that the students would be sympathetic with the Palestinian position. So I decided to argue the contrary position for the purposes of ensuring that there was a debate and they had something to react to. I don't think I was exceeding my epistemic warrant in that, teacher's warrant in that context, because I was ensuring there was a debate, that they had something to react to. So maybe one of the problems here is actually there's an absence of doctrine or belief in adult society. I'm not advocating indoctrination, but I'm just saying there's something here that, is there a problem with the kids just being confronted with the void of adulthood, which they don't then have anything to react to?
Thanks very much, Toby. John?
OK, I'll try and be as quick as possible. In answer to the person who talked about gender and whether, how do you handle that? I mean, you linked it to biology, but what I would say is that you want to just be clear that there are different scholars who have different positions with regard to gender identity theory, and that there is no challenge, there's no issue for you to actually present those different positions in the classroom. And within my class, I do that. Obviously, it's not linked to biology in a scientific sense, but I do that in the session that Alka does for me each year. Within that group, I have sessions on gender critical positions every year. And there has never been any questioning of that, because I don't say you must believe this or this is the only position. It actually is there are different positions and we can engage with them. With regard to what was said about kind of teachers having a mammoth task, absolutely they do. And I would say it's made worse by the fact that what they're being taught themselves or what they're being kind of given by ITT providers is very, very partial. And, I'll give you an example. This isn't an ITT provider, but this is one of the leading educational figures within history teaching in this country. He created this absolutely kind of supposedly best practice scheme on LGBT plus history for Key Stage 3. And the scheme is to be taught backwards. Now, I ask people in here to question why that is. Why the actual historical development of that movement as it evolved was not the way that you are supposed to teach that. And I think people can draw their own conclusions about what's going on there. And the final point about kind of Israel-Palestine, I can't say whether there's particular dominant positions all in different, in different locations, in different schools, in different colleges. What I would say is just try and provide as much information and as much kind of and a different range of interpretation. You might see you've got a moral equivalence. You know, I think it's very difficult to just do anything other than here are conflicting positions. We are providing you with access to them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Alka.
Thank you. On the question of teachers, if we're going to train doctors, it would be unthinkable to train doctors unless they came across, you know, some knowledge of biology. When we train teachers, our equivalent of biology is knowledge. How many teachers even are familiar with the word epistemology, never mind the debates around it? How many teachers have a sense of the different warrants for belief, opinion, personal opinion, political opinions, knowledge claims, disciplinary knowledge claims? So I think until we have an education, a system and a way of educating teachers to familiarise them with that, we're sending teachers out really disadvantaged into their professional work. Should we teach kids logic at a younger age? I certainly agree with the kind of conversations that you were describing, Ruth, that you can have with children, but I wouldn't call them philosophy, and certainly not logic. And the reason for that is that children aren't mini adults. They're developmental physically and also in terms of their capacities. I was an English teacher, and the difficulty of teaching young children the difference between an abstract noun and, say, a plural collective noun, it takes a long time, right, with young kids. And that's because their ability to think in abstract terms is not purely, it kind of requires quite a lot of experience as well as knowledge and thinking and discussions for that to develop. So I don't think it can be done, you know, at a younger age. There's not a fixed age. You have to be sensitive and you need professional judgment to decide that sort of thing. On the question of hearing horrible, pernicious beliefs, well, you know, I think the thing is that you have to. This is what I would do if I was to hear that. If I thought it was something that was important, and if it was appropriate for the age group, think, okay, this is an age group, it knows about, it's got a sense of what's going on in the world politically, thinks it's important, has this belief about it that I hate, or I disagree with, or I don't think is quite right, whatever. You then have to think, well, you know, is it my job as a teacher to change their beliefs? And this is going to be really hard, but no, it isn't, right? It isn't. You must not try and change their belief. What I would do is think, I will do my best to create a lesson or a series of lessons that does the kind of thing John was alluding to. Not just information, but look at, give them the historical information of the background of it, give them different interpretations of the consequences of that today, talk about the geopolitical situation, talk about the changes in Islam, you know, the development of Islamism, difference from Islam, the religion. You know, you could choose, but your criteria would have to be from the knowledge, the disciplinary knowledge, okay? And then you could say, people feel very strongly about this in different ways today. People believe different things. Some people believe Israel had it coming. Some people believe Israel didn't have it coming. Some people believe Hamas are to blame. You could lay out the different beliefs, and say, you know, I would personally say that is up to you to decide, but this is not going to be in the class right now. You may want to talk to your parents about it. And whatever you do, if you're talking about it out in the corridors or break time, you do it respecting the person, even if you disagree with the ideas.
Thank you. Can we thank our panel for doing the right thing twice? So first of all, they stood by Alka and they stepped down from that initial panel when Alka was no platformed, and that's exemplary. That's what people should do. And it makes a massive difference. And I think if they hadn't done that, it had gone away, then these stories just disappear. And if the cancelled person isn't somebody like Alka with a degree of a platform that you've created for yourself and, you know, is already a respected figure, They just kind of disappear, and we don't even know that these things happen often. If they don't come to us at the Free Speech Union, we don't know that these things happen, and they undoubtedly happen far more often than any of us ever know about. So I just would really like to...
Can I just say one final thing in response to that very, very quickly? This is how pernicious this situation would actually be. If the organiser of that conference had not given Alka an official apology and that wasn't in the public domain, it's quite possible I would not have been able to invite her to my college again to actually do a session for my students, because she would be someone who has been deplatformed. That's how important these issues are. It's not even just that one example. It will then have a ripple effect beyond that.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. And just so that the Free Speech Union can take a tiny bit of credit, we did write to the organiser of the conference very, very quickly, which is one of the things we're really good at, and remind them of Alka's rights and of the necessity of open debate, and particularly in education more than any other sphere of life as it happens. So I think I would encourage, therefore, people who are not already members of the Free Speech Union to take a leaflet and to join us. This is the kind of thing we do. We represent individuals, whether you're Alka or anybody else, whether you want to have a public presence on issues that are difficult in the world, or whether you don't and you still get into trouble. We will defend our members, and we also campaign in the world more broadly about the really important issues of the day. So but obviously the second thing that the panellists did was to, at very short notice, come and join us to restage the debate and re-platform Alka, and to hold a really, really informative debate, and to do so in a way that is just incredibly open in the way that they've taken part in this. And hopefully people have found it useful, even if it hasn't actually nailed everything down and tidied it all up for you. At least it's opened things up in the first place, which is probably all we can do at the moment. Things are very, very difficult, and I don't envy the role of teachers. So can we just thank our panel, and thank you all for coming. And if there is any wine left, you're welcome to finish it off before you go.
Jan, do you mind if I just tell people about the debates at the Battle of Ideas? Yeah, if that's okay. Yeah, sorry, just very quickly, just also to say there's a whole day of education-related debates at the Battle of Ideas put forward by the Education Forum, as well as multiple sessions. So I think there's a leaflet on your seat, including one on anti-Semitism in Israel at 75, where we're going to continue some of these debates. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks. Right. Off you go. To the wine bottles or to the pub. Thank you.